He was the man who led the search for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I'll speak to Hans Blix about the threat of nuclear war and ask Noam Chomsky about the US presidential election. I'm Mehdi Hassan. On this week's show, who's legendary US academic Noam Chomsky going to vote for in the presidential election come November? Find out in part 2 of my extended interview with him. But first, earlier this month, the North Korean regime claimed to have successfully tested a hydrogen bomb, reigniting fears over its nuclear capabilities. And this week, the world's Doomsday Clock, symbolizing the countdown to global catastrophe, remains stuck at 3 minutes to midnight. Midnight signifying the apocalypse. So how worried should we be about nuclear Armageddon? This week's headliner was famously the chief UN weapons inspector in the run-up to the Iraq War, and also served as head of the International Atomic Energy Authority. From Stockholm, Hans Blix. Hans Blix, thanks for joining me on UpFront. The Doomsday Clock, that metaphorical clock which is supposed to show how close we are to the end of the world, was set by scientists this week at 3 minutes to midnight. The closest to midnight it's been since 1984. How worried are you by the prospect of nuclear war?
Well, I think the clock reminds us that in addition to the some 20,000 nuclear warheads that you find in the US and Russia and the traditional nuclear weapon states, we also have countries like North Korea that are moving on and even testing, which the other states are not doing. So yes, it is a real concern. And if they were to develop long-range missiles too, yes, it would be even more worrying.
They do claim to have carried out their 4th nuclear weapons test at the start of this year, a miniaturized hydrogen bomb which panicked a lot of people. How panicked are you by that? How worried should we be? How seriously should we take the North Korean nuclear weapons program?
I think we should take it seriously, perhaps not necessarily because of this particular test or that shows that they are advancing. But we have, for many years, we have had talks with them, we have sanctions, and talks in Beijing with the 6 powers, and nothing seems to have worked. And the query is, can one design a strategy to get to results? The North Koreans may be looking at Gaddafi, and they may look at Saddam, and say what happened to him and them when they gave in. Well, they both disappeared. You know that the US has also on occasion offered North Korea that they could have a peace treaty. That would be an important part because they identify the US as their big enemy. However, that may not have been enough. They may ask themselves, what is the better for their safety and security? Is it a paper guarantee from the US or a bomb? So I think you need more than just a peace treaty with the US. And I think the Chinese, as rightly I think, are identified in the US and elsewhere as a key player because the North Koreans are dependent upon them. So I think the permanent members of the Security Council, in particular the US and Russia and China, and here added with Japan, of course, and South Korea, will have to work very closely together.
You mentioned the United Nations and the Security Council. There's that famous scene in the 2004 movie Team America World Police. I'm not sure if you've seen it, where Kim Jong-il's character feeds your character
of course
to the sharks. And it's supposed to show how weak and toothless the UN and weapons inspectors such as yourself are in the face of brutal dictators. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Well, I thought it funny. That was the thing that made me famous in the world. But at the same time, I don't think they are right, because actual observations have a role to play. When we were in Iraq and we reported that we had not seen any nuclear or other weapons of mass destruction, it wasn't taken seriously by Washington. But it turned out that we were closer to the truth than anybody else. Now that's a sad thing, and I think everybody recognizes that it would be wise to listen to international inspectors because they are on ground and they are independent and they are professional.
Iran has agreed to a historic nuclear agreement last year, which includes what's been described as the most robust inspection regime ever negotiated. Are you a supporter of the Iran nuclear deal, or do you think it's too soft on Tehran?
No, I think it is a very good deal, and I take off my hat to Kerry and to Lavrov and to Zarif of Iran for their patience, and for Catherine Ashton. All of them, they're showing that diplomacy did work. But it also cost a lot for the US presidency for Obama, and Kerry, it cost a lot in terms of action with the opposition. And in Iran too. I think that the Rouhani and Zarif have had a hard time with the conservatives on that side. What has now happened through this agreement is that Iran has committed itself to scale down the program very drastically. They will have only so and so many centrifuges, etc. Very severe scaling down to a level which will be sort of understandable in terms of peaceful uses of nuclear energy. They have made great concessions. The US has committed itself to stop punishing Iran. I don't see that as a very great concession. I think the agreement is very, very great progress, and one should also remember that Russia played an important role in this. We often talk about Russia and their acting in the Ukraine against the UN Charter, etc. This is true. There's a right criticism. But at the same time, we saw that in the case of Syrian chemical weapons, Russia helped the US to solve this situation. And now, in the case of Iran, they're also helpful, and we are hoping that there will be some beginning to a solution of the Syrian civil war, where Russia will help.
What about those critics of the Iran deal, for example, the Prime Minister of Israel and every single Republican presidential candidate who say it's a bad deal, it's a weak deal, that it merely puts things on hold for 10 years, after which Iran will be able to freely carry on as it was before with its uranium enrichment program?
The US thinks that they can switch on sanctions any moment, but they must be aware that they are not alone in this game. It's also the rest of the world. It's sanctions of the Security Council and the European Union. In Europe, there are not far less qualms about the agreement with Iran, much more enthusiasm.
When you were running the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Authority, that organization took a lot of steps to address, to tackle, to challenge, to investigate Iran's alleged nuclear weapons program. What did it ever do about Israel's actual nuclear weapons program?
Well, nothing really, because Israel in the first place has not adhered to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Israel is not obliged to stay away from nuclear weapons under any international commitment. They certainly disappointed Nixon and the United States and the world in making a nuclear weapon, but it was not a breach of the law. Actually, Iran could theoretically have done the same thing. They could also have withdrawn from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then what they had been doing would have been legal. I think it remains a big problem that Israel has nuclear weapons, and that in the long run, a zone free not only of weapons of mass destruction, but also of installations to produce highly enriched uranium or plutonium should go away. But that's certainly not where we are today.
The scientists behind the Doomsday Clock, when they're calculating how close we may be to the end of the world, they obviously also look at the threat from climate change. 2015 was the hottest year on record, according to the United Nations. Is climate change a bigger threat, in your view, than nuclear war or even international terrorism?
I confess I'm more worried about the climate change, because the nuclear, we have now managed to live for 70 years without a further nuclear war exploded in wartime. Whereas in the case of the global warming, we are dealing with 7 billion people who are trying to use a lot of power in the future. I mean, oddly in a way, nuclear energy plays a role in both situations. In the case of the bomb, of course, it's nuclear energy that gives it explosive force. In the case of the global warming, nuclear energy in the form of nuclear power plants may interestingly be one important part of the solution. I think we should be very pleased that China and India are going full scale ahead with nuclear power, because that gives them huge chunks of electricity. It's not without problems, I'm not saying that, and no energy generation is without some problem. But this certainly is an existing means of generating huge amounts of energy without adding to the greenhouse gases.
In the United States and other Western countries, people seem to be much more worried these days about the possibility of a terrorist attack from a group such as ISIL, rather than the threat from climate change. ISIL is now dominating the headlines. You, of course, were deeply involved in the run-up to the Iraq war in 2003 as the chief UN weapons inspector. Had the United States and the UK and others not invaded Iraq, would we have the ISIL threat that we have today? Would ISIL even exist, in your view?
I think it is doubtful that it would have existed, because many of their cadres came from people who were dissatisfied Sunnis. In Iraq, the Shiites came to power, and the Sunnis were sort of ostracized, and many of them joined the ISIS. So that was an important element of the sad evolution that we have had. I think neither Iraq, Libya or Syria, they all show the difficulty of doing something from the outside. You may say that if you hadn't done this, then Saddam would have been there, Gaddafi would have been there, but I think one should ask the people there, not we in the West, we should ask the people there, which would you prefer? Do you prefer tyranny to anarchy, or vice versa? They got rid of tyranny, but they got anarchy.
I think many Iraqis would still say today they prefer a life without Saddam than with Saddam.
Oh, I think so too. But do they prefer anarchy to tyranny?
Do you ever feel regret, maybe guilt even, that you weren't able to speak out and stop the Iraq invasion from happening? In the years since, you've effectively accused Bush and Blair of lying about the WMD threat, but you didn't say that at the time when it might have made a difference had you taken a stronger stance.
Well, the basic difficulty is that you cannot prove the negative. I could not say in 2003 that, hey, there are no chemical weapons or no biological weapons. I was quite convinced there were no nuclear weapons, but I could not say that because they are so small, they could be hidden, and they would have said, if I said we don't find any, they say, have you looked here, have you looked there, etc. So you cannot, if you're asked objectively to report about the situation, ever say, no, there is absolutely nothing. You cannot prove the negative. I think they should have understood that the likelihood was very little that anything remained. We went to lots of sites that were recommended to us by the US intelligence and British intelligence as likely places for weapons of mass destruction. And we reported to them that no, in none of these cases did we find any weapons of mass destruction. So I think we said at the time rightly that if this was the best they had, what was the rest?
Did you know at the time, or did you believe at the time, that they were misrepresenting the intelligence, that they were not telling the truth?
Yes, I think when I listened to Colin Powell, I was a bit amazed at it. Now, many of the things that he reported were things we could not check and did not know. There were telephone calls that had been listened to, etc. But some others sounded odd, and I said so in the Security Council. And I also warned both the US, Condoleezza Rice, and Blair that we were not at all impressed by the evidence. And I said to Blair that it wouldn't be paradoxical if you invaded Iraq with 250,000 men and found that there were no weapons of mass destruction.
Hans Blix, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Don't believe everything you read, especially when it comes to the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea and its brutal totalitarian leader, Kim Jong-un. Every time any new information about the dear leader comes out of the Hermit Kingdom, it goes viral. And the same thing happened with his father and grandfather, who were also the subject of sensational stories and the butt of much parody. How much of what we're told, though, is actually true? In 2014, for example, it was widely reported that Kim Jong-un fed his rebellious uncle to a pack of wild dogs. 120 starving dogs, to be precise. True or false? Turns out the story was false. It originated on a satirical Chinese blog, and yet many publications in the West have still not retracted or amended their original stories. So, what really happened with the uncle?
She was shot to death.
Okay, so he's definitely a nasty, violent dictator, but perhaps not the kind of dictator who feeds close relatives to packs of dogs. Incidentally, Kim has also been accused of silencing his critics with rocket grenades, flamethrowers, and even mortars. But the jury's still out on whether any of these methods were actually ever used. Also in 2014, it was suggested that all North Korean men were being forced to cut their hair to look like Kim Jong-un. Sounds, and let's be honest, looks like a clear human rights abuse. False. The story traces back to one rather dubious article. No proof whatsoever has emerged to substantiate this truly bizarre claim. How about North Korea hacking Sony Pictures and threatening terrorist attacks if US theaters played The Interview, a satirical movie about an assassination attempt on Kim Jong-un? That was true, right?
North Korea engaged in this attack.
But here's why it may be false. Leading cybersecurity analysts have since concluded it was most likely an inside job by disgruntled Sony employees who may have collaborated with outside hackers. Whoops! Now, if so much about Kim and the DPRK is false, what's actually true? Well, a report by the United Nations found the North Korean regime has committed crimes against humanity, including murder, enslavement, torture, imprisonment, rape, forced abortion, and other sexual violence against the population. And in January, they decided to spend their limited cash on another alleged nuclear test instead of food for their starving citizens. See, Kim's crimes against the North Korean people are bad enough without us having to invent stuff to make him look extra crazy and extra kooky. Turning the dear leader into a cartoon character who we mock and laugh at doesn't do anything to help his oppressed people. So remember, clickbait out of North Korea tends to be just that, clickbait. Time now for part 2 of my exclusive interview with Noam Chomsky, in which the professor gives us his take on the global impact of the US presidential race and the rise of Islamophobia. I began by asking him if he wants to see Senator Bernie Sanders, the self-styled socialist candidate for the Democratic nomination, in the White House come November.
First of all, Bernie Sanders may use the word socialist, but he's basically a New Dealer. Now, in the current American political spectrum,
yes,
to be a New Dealer is to be way out on the left.
Yes.
Eisenhower, for example, who said anyone who questions the New Deal doesn't belong in the political system would be regarded as a raving leftist. So Bernie Sanders is a decent, honest New Dealer. I agree with him in a lot of things, not in other things. I frankly think that our system of mainly bought elections, he doesn't have much of a chance. But if he were elected, I think he would, of the current candidates, I think he'd be the one who would have, from my point of view, the best policies. Incidentally, I don't say it's a charade. There are differences in the parties. I don't think they're great differences, but they're real. And small differences in a system of great power can have enormous consequences.
You're saying, actually, if it's Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump or Ted Cruz, vote Hillary Clinton, the lesser of two evils?
Exactly.
She's your preferred candidate out of her versus the Republicans?
Well, it's exactly what I've said in every previous election. If you happen to be, say, in Massachusetts, where we are now, which is a safe state.
For the Democrats.
So you can vote any way you want or not vote. If you happen to be in a swing state where it's going to have an effect on who becomes president, you should definitely vote. I mean, if you
you're in Ohio this November, you vote Clinton rather than Donald Trump or Ted Cruz?
Oh, absolutely. Just as I would in 2000. I didn't like Obama, but I said exactly the same thing. There's a
so Hillary has your vote if you were in a swing state?
Well, let's put it that way.
Yes.
My vote would be against the Republican candidate. If you abstain, that means you're giving a vote for the Republican
Just out of
candidate.
interest, very briefly, if you had to sum up, somebody says to you, Professor Chomsky, I've read your books, I've looked at US foreign policy, I've seen Hillary Clinton, I've seen President George Bush, they all seem the same to me. Why should I vote for Clinton against the Republicans? In a sentence or two, what would you say is the difference between Hillary Clinton and, say, Ted Cruz? That makes it worth voting for her against Cruz?
There are enormous differences.
Just sum up for me what you think it is.
Carpet bombing Syria, for example, is a difference. Ted Cruz says, it's an easy problem, we'll just carpet bomb them. What's the effect of carpet bombing?
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. Take, say, the nuclear deal with Iran. Every Republican says they're going to kill it.
Yeah.
That's, I assume if they do, that would isolate the United States. It would presumably continue between Europe and Iran. But that would be a very big step backwards. Now, take, say, maybe the biggest problem we face, destruction of the environment. Every Republican candidate is either a climate change denier or a skeptic who says you can't do it. What they are, just a minute, what they are saying is, let's destroy the world. Is that worth voting against? Yeah. There was a meeting in Paris which could not come up with a binding treaty. The major reason was it couldn't get past the Republican Congress. Same thing domestically. The policies are quite different.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, and I agree with you, they are quite different. So if I mention to you the neuroscientist and liberal atheist author Sam Harris, who you've had an online debate with, he says he'd rather Republican candidate Ben Carson, who said a Muslim shouldn't be president and has compared Syrian refugees to dogs. he said that Harris has said he would rather Carson be president of the United States than you, because Carson apparently gets the threat from so-called jihadi terrorists that you don't. What's your response to Sam Harris, who claims to be a liberal?
I don't bother with Sam Harris. This is, he specializes in hysterical, slanderous charges against people he doesn't like. That's of no interest to me. Am I not concerned with jihadi terrorism? I'm much more concerned with it than he is. That's why I say you don't just scream at it. You look at the roots, you try to figure out how to deal with it, you respond to it. I don't take him seriously. I don't see any point in talking about him. But,
well, some people would say the point about talking about it is we live in an environment where Islamophobia is on the rise in the United States, across the West. There are some who say that the new atheists, people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, the late Christopher Hitchens, are Islamophobes, guilty of an almost obsessive anti-Muslim bigotry, which is worrying in the current climate. Do you share that view?
I don't talk about them. First of all, I don't think it's true of Dawkins. It might have been true of Hitchens in his later years. Harris, I assume, denies it, but when I read what he says, that's what it looks like. However, the problem of Islamophobia is, of course, serious, just like the problem of anti-Semitism is serious.
Indeed.
This is much worse, Islamophobia now. For one thing, it is undermining us. If Islamophobia, apart from what it's doing to decent, honorable people who are subject to denunciation, physical attacks, blocking of the possibilities for decent life, what's happening to Syrian refugees and so on. Apart from all that, it's harmful to the West. Islamophobia leads to proposals like, let's carpet bomb them, that let's hit them with a sledgehammer. Just take a look at what it's led to in the last 15 years. There's been what's called a global war on terror. When it began, there's been one device to deal with it, sledgehammer. Smash them up. Don't find out what's going on. Smash them up. What's happened? 15 years ago, it was confined to a tiny tribal area in Afghanistan. Now it's all over the world. Every time you hit it with a sledgehammer, you expand it. Every single time. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, everywhere. Can you learn something from that? Shall we say, okay, let's smash them up again because they all want to kill us? Yeah, that's one reaction. Another reaction is the sane reaction, which you do hear from people like who know something about the topic, like Scott Atran or like William Polk, a well-known Middle East expert, long experience in the U.S. government, has pretty much the same proposals. You have to deal with the situation rationally if you want to be, first of all, humane, but even concerned with your own security.
Yeah. You're 87 years old. You've written more than 100 books, taught for more than half a century. You're known globally. You've made massive contributions in the field of linguistics, in foreign policy, international relations. And yet your ideas, your worldview has never really gone mainstream, especially here in the United States. Does that depress you, that you're not living in anywhere kind of like the society you'd like to, that the foreign policy isn't the way you'd want it to be, that you haven't had that impact here?
I never anticipated living in Utopia. If I was in the mainstream, I'd begin to ask myself what I'm doing wrong. There have been, not because of me, but many people, there has been notable progress over the years, not uniform, there's regression as well, but in many respects it's a more civilized world than it was before. When George Bush and Tony Blair decided to invade Iraq, it was the first time in the history of imperialism, and that was imperialism, straight out, that there was massive protest even before the war was officially launched. Didn't stop the war, but I think it restricted it. They could never use the modes that were used by Lyndon Johnson, for example. Well, that's progress. In other respects, there's progress too. Take something like women's rights. Huge difference in the last 50 years. Civil rights, mixed differences. There's a concern over the environment. That's a matter of life and death for the species. It's quite different from what it was 20, 30 years ago. And in many respects, there is slow progress.
So you're an optimist about the future?
Look, you have two choices. You can say, I'm a pessimist nothing's going to work, I'm giving up, I'll help ensure that the worst will happen. Or you can grasp onto the opportunities that do exist, the rays of hope that exist, and say, well, maybe we can make it a better world. It's not much of a choice.
Noam Chomsky, thanks for joining me on UpFront. Appreciate it.